Our speaker this morning is Board of Visitors Professor of Economics and President Emeritus of Old Dominion University. He also has held teaching and research positions at Illinois State University, Cal State Los Angeles, University of Grenoble in France, Brown University, Rhode Island College, Ball State University, the College or the University of Hawaii, the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia, and the University of Montana. He served as president of the University of Montana and Old Dominion University, and was named one of the 100 most effective college presidents in the United States. 13 years, Dr. Koch has produced the widely cited State of the Region report for the Hampton Roads, Virginia metropolitan area that analyzes and assesses the region's economic, political, and social conditions. Please, a BBTA warm welcome for Dr. James Koch.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. This is, in fact, lucky 13 in terms of coming and talking to you. I've been told I have to stay right in here because so I'm not going to wander around quite as much as I do. But first, a word from my sponsors. These are the individuals that make the State of the Region report possible. They've been very generous financially, and if you see one of them, pat them on the back because I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be doing this without them. This is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk, of course, about defense and sequestration, a good deal, but also talk about the port and tourism, which are two of the other major legs on our economic stool. And then, of course, we'll do Q&A. And I promise that I will say a little bit about the Virginia Beach Arena as well. This is the theme. We're moving ahead regionally, economically speaking, but not nearly as fast as we would like. Growth has been tepid. Here's one indicator of that. We are the blue stuff here. So our growth rate now is below the national growth rate. There have been times, especially over the last decade, when because of rising defense spending, economic growth was above the national average, but now, especially because defense spending has decelerated, our growth rate is a little bit slower. These data just came out yesterday, and these are unemployment rates, and specifically this Hampton Roads rate went up 0.8% this last month. So a big upward climb in the unemployment rate. Some of this probably is due to people getting hired around Christmas and so forth, but that's unusually high as an increase. I said to the Virginian pilot, they actually quoted me this morning, that some of this is already due to sequestration because the DOD was anticipating sequestration and already doing things to make it a little bit easier for them to deal with it if and when it came. So some of this is already the first effects of sequestration within the region. The reason I have Virginia Beach in red is not because I'm in Virginia Beach now, but simply that's the lowest rate of unemployment in the region. So the beach is doing comparatively well in terms of unemployment rates. This graph is actually a little bit out of date because the defense portion of this is actually higher than 45% now, but roughly 46, 47% of the regional economy depends upon defense spending. And we've got the port for about 10%, tourism for about 9%. So the big three on our economic stool account for 60% plus of all the economic activity in the region. So one of the reasons that things are slowing down now, economically speaking, in the region is that each of these three things is slowing down or they're not doing quite as well as we would like. So I want to talk about each of those three now in some degree of detail.
Doctor, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Do most regions have an industry that consumes a very large percentage of their economy, like financial services, I was told, like in New York, was like over 50% or some huge percentage or something like that? Are we that different from most regions that are dominated by one industry?
We're different because that 46, 47% is larger than just about any other region you can think about. Even in financial services in New York City, you're talking something in the range of 25 to 30% of their total output is due to that. You'd have to go to like Jacksonville, North Carolina or someplace like that to find another region where defense spending is so important. But federal spending in general is very, very important. This is Virginia, and this is the percentage of Virginia total economic activity that is due to federal spending. You can see that's almost 35%, whereas the national average is something like about 25%. So the Commonwealth of Virginia, if the federal government is that big mother pig, the sow, we're little piggies right there getting our sustenance in Virginia because we're highly, highly dependent upon federal spending, and sequestration is going to affect these other things as well. Turns out inside Hampton Roads, about 85 or 90% of sequestration's effects are coming from defense spending and not from the rest of this, but they will affect us as well. This is defense spending at Hampton Roads. Kind of tough for some of you to see that, but you can see the size of the bars, and you can see that defense spending has been topping out slowly within the region. We think this year in Hampton Roads we're going to be roughly about the same place, maybe slightly below. So defense spending is tailing off, and that's been the economic engine that drove our economy over the last decade. Once you take account of inflation, we still had a real growth rate in defense spending over the last decade of slightly more than 6% a year in the region. So that was a tremendous economic engine for us, and the bad news is that that's disappearing. The worm has turned. This gives you some notion of defense spending dependency. Back about the turn of the century, about 1/3 of our economic activity was dependent on defense spending. Now, this last year, it's 47.5%. So there are some people who think that our economy has become more diversified over the last decade, but actually, of course, the reverse is true. We are more sensitive now to defense spending than ever before. When one looks at the estimated impact of sequestration, if it goes through without any modifications, which I don't think is going to be what turns out, but we don't know the answer yet, this is going to cost us about $2 billion of economic activity in the region. Now, to put this in context for you, our total gross regional product is something like $83 or $84 billion a year. So this is a little bit more than 2%. And so you can see some of the kinds of things that are likely to get cut. We thought at Old Dominion prior to sequestration we would add about 5,000 jobs this year. Sequestration, if it goes through unabated, that's going to cost us 17,000 jobs, so the net is going to be about a negative 12,000 job decrease for us in the region if sequestration goes through without any kinds of modifications at all. You can see that in terms of job losses, we're talking about something like 2/3 of 1% of all the jobs in the region. But again, to sort of place this in context, I talked about sequestration costing us about $2+ billion a year. The Ford Motor assembly plant closing, that was like a $400 million thing. So this is 4 or 5 times as large as that in terms of the anticipated economic impact. Just to break this down a little bit, some people look at personnel in the armed forces and say, well, that's where all the money is being spent. Of course, a lot is. But procurement and contracts are the major kinds of things. And it's precisely there that some of the anticipation of sequestration is being felt, where you're talking about ship repair and maintenance in downtown Norfolk and Portsmouth and places like that. Those contracts have been narrowed down or not extended or canceled in some cases, and that's beginning to impact us immediately. Now, the governing legislation is the Budget Control Act of 2011, and it specifically prohibits cutting active duty military personnel. We have about roughly 95,000 in the region, but the 39,000 civilian employees are fair game. And they are the people who are really going to feel the impact of sequestration. Those are the individuals who are going to get furloughed. Those are the people who, for the rest of this fiscal year, probably will lose 1 day a week of work if current kinds of practices continue. Federal fiscal year, I think most of you know, begins on October 1st. So we're about halfway through that. So in order to come up with the $43 billion, they have to do lots more of what they might have been able to spread out over a full fiscal year if they had the time to do it. But again, I've already pointed out that the DOD in particular has been anticipating sequestration and doing lots of things so that this isn't going to be quite as powerful or negative as it might have been. Now this is an interesting graph because it relates to 3 different models or scenarios for defense spending. The blue line is what defense spending would have been anticipated to be had there been no previous military budget cuts and no sequestration. The red line is the expansion of defense spending, taking into account the roughly $500 billion of defense spending cuts that have been agreed on over the next 10 years. That's already sort of cooked into the recipe, so the red basically is where we would have been prior to sequestration. Now the green is sequestration. But notice this, the real cut occurs right here. This fiscal year or the next fiscal year, after that defense spending continues to increase at pretty much the previous rate. But the major impact we're going to feel is in the next 2 fiscal years. This one for about 6 months, and then the next one for, of course, about 12 months. So it isn't really correct to say that defense spending has been damaged forever, but we're certainly going to feel the effects of that over the next couple of years. Making this more interesting in some ways is the fact that there are lots of things that are exempt, not just active duty military personnel, but Social Security payments and certain kinds of things in the U.S. Department of Justice can't be cut. So what it means is the targets have been narrowed down. I was out in Montana a couple of weeks ago, and the things they worry about there are when Glacier Park and Yellowstone Park are going to open. They're going to open late, and they're not going to have as many people, and they're not going to do certain kinds of things, because that's not one of the things that is exempt. And there are certain kinds of things in education and welfare and so forth that are going to get cut. But the focus of this is much more narrow, and so they're going to feel a little bit more. So where are the cuts likely to come? Almost surely the 39,000 are going to feel this rather visibly. Ship repair and maintenance, the Admiral and I were just talking about the extent to which these things are going to actually occur, whether there's going to be flexibility given to the DOD so that the DOD can reallocate funding to do some of these things. The Admiral said he thought this likely to occur, and if so, that would be good news for the region, because there are about 20,000 employees at Huntington Ingalls and Newport News who are dependent on those kinds of things. We're already feeling diminished procurement. I think part of the increased unemployment rate in the region over the last month was due to that. Fewer ship deployments. We know about the Harry S. Truman, and when they get deployed, they're going to be there longer periods of time, because that does reduce expense a bit. And of course, canceled contracts for ship repair and maintenance. So that certainly already is occurring here. Well, I need to place this in context. And I know I'm living in a military community here, but I have to say that the size of sequestration overall is pretty small. When you look at the total size of the federal government budget, this is pretty small stuff. So, for example, when I was out in Montana there, the people there are sort of saying, oh, this is basically a problem with the political class of the folks in Washington. This is not big stuff. And I think we have to remember in Hampton Roads that if you live in Memphis or Chicago or Oklahoma City or someplace, you're not going to feel this nearly in the same way we will here. We're exceptionally vulnerable because of that 47% dependence upon defense spending. Also, Virginia is more vulnerable because we have so much general federal spending in the region. But this is kind of small potatoes. And if you look at what's happened to the market since sequestration started, I'm talking about the stock market, investors have essentially said, this is good. Or at least they're not worried about it. Investors have kind of looked at this and said, well, I'm imputing some thoughts here. If this is the only way you can cut spending, then okay, it's a blunt instrument. It's not very flexible, but it really is doing some things to deal with our budget deficit. So when you think about defense spending, that's an issue here in certain areas of the country, but not in all. This is an interesting graph because it shows what's happened to total employment in our region. And you can see that back in 2007, we peaked at about 775,000 jobs, and now we're back up to 742. So the Great Recession cost us about 40,000 jobs, and we've gotten back roughly 12,000 of those. So if I could quickly go back to that previous slide, you remember when I said I thought the net effect of sequestration would cost us about 12,000 jobs? So that would basically take away that gain. So we haven't been creating jobs in the region. That's what it really comes down to. And to show you how we differ from other areas, 2003 to 2010, we lost 2,400 jobs here in Hampton Roads, but Charlotte gained 42,000, Jacksonville gained 19,000, Raleigh-Durham gained 73,000. You can see that the other regions are doing lots better than we are. If there's one thermometer of economic activity in the region that I could point to, it is net migration. And our net migration in the region has been negative over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. Now, I know our population is growing, but that's because we're having more kids. But more people are leaving the region as adults that are coming in, and that reflects jobs. People go where the jobs are. And so we're not creating jobs nearly as fast as other regions of the country, and that's, at least over the intermediate term, let's say over the rest of this decade, not really good news for us. But here's sort of an interesting, and you'll sort of look at this and say, well, how can this be? Median household income in our region is growing really faster than the national average. Why so? Well, 3 reasons really. Our household sizes are higher here, so we have more people in households, more people working than a typical household nationally. Second, people work longer hours here. It's only about a half an hour or an hour per week, but we work longer hours. And then finally, military compensation has been going up rather rapidly in the region. Here are some numbers for you in that regard. Military compensation over the last decade went up 97.9% compared to private sector at 32.7%. Now we have a voluntary military. We have to attract and retain. So I'm not here to argue that this wasn't a good idea. If we're going to do what we're going to do, we have to pay the people. I would point out, though, that this isn't necessarily wages and salaries. An awful lot of those fringe benefits, housing, allowances, etc. But the really relevant point for us in terms of our economic picture here is don't expect that to continue over this next decade. This last decade was a major exception. Rapid expansion in compensation because we were expanding the military and we were in Iraq and Afghanistan and doing lots of different things. I don't think we're likely to be in that kind of circumstance over the next decade. And so this particular economic engine, which really pushed us along over the last decade, I'm not going to say it's going to be sputtering, but the number is going to be probably more like this over the next decade, where the increases are much more moderate and gentle. As a consequence, if we're only looking at compensation, this was the private sector about 10 years ago. This is our private sector in the region now. The private sector then just hasn't been doing very well in Hampton Roads. We're just not creating jobs. One could speculate a lot as to why that's so, but it is. Well, I said there are three legs on our economic stool. I just looked at defense. Let's now look at the port and tourism. This is cargo tonnage at the Port of Virginia, the Port of Hampton Roads, and you can see it peaked out in 2008 and we're almost back to the same level, but we really got hit by the recession. One of the reasons that, I think anyway, not that he consulted me, but the governor turned over the membership of the Virginia Port Authority was that the port really took a major hit and didn't recover as fast as some of the other ports did along the East Coast. If you look at market shares, we in Hampton Roads are the red. You can see that our market share relative to Savannah, New York City, Charleston, and so forth has been going down. We recovered a bit this year. We had a pretty good year in the port in 2012. But our port hasn't done as well as the other ports on the coast. Now some might immediately leap and say, well, that's because they're not managed well or something like that, and maybe they're not managed well, but in the case of Savannah, their major advantages are located close to Atlanta and the rest of the southeastern United States where economic growth rates are higher. So they're sitting on top of their own economic engine there that's really producing lots more activity for them. Then, in addition, the state of Georgia has invested pretty heavily in infrastructure, highways, scouring out the port. They're doing a variety of things that have made that port more competitive. By contrast, we haven't done as much of that here. Then a third reason is that Savannah has pursued a somewhat different strategy strategically with respect to its port compared to us. We've tended to sign contracts with shippers like Maersk, Hanjin, etc., whereas Savannah has concentrated on distributors, the Walmarts, the Costcos, and so forth. They have almost double the number of large warehouse operations there where the large distributors are active around Savannah. We're doing more of that now sort of to the west around Suffolk and so forth, but we've really trailed there. Long story short, their strategy seems to have worked better than ours. They've done better than we have and have an increasing market share. What does all this mean relative to the notion of privatizing the port's management? Well, this is a complicated issue, and I have to be careful about what I say here because the Secretary of Transportation hired me to think right thoughts. I'm not sure they're paying attention to my thoughts, but that's another matter. Virtually all of the major ports, in fact, all of the major ports in the United States have privatized management. We're about the only one that does not. But they typically have several managers, or even 5 or 6 managers, such as they do in New York City. What's being contemplated here in Hampton Roads is a single manager like APM Maersk, or whoever J.P. Morgan would bring in, since they're the two major, in fact, the only remaining applicants. The danger here is that APM, for example, and Maersk could whipsaw the Port of Hampton Roads against New York City and other places where they're located. That we would have problems with them in terms of rates and where they would decide to put cargo and so forth, and that's worrisome. Another worry, or another concern, is that the Panama Canal is being redone. It's now been sort of delayed to 2015. When it reopens in the context of being able to handle larger ships, that will be advantageous for us because we're a deep draft port. Maybe if we were going to privatize the port's operation, it would be smarter to wait until Panama Canal is finished and all of a sudden our port would be worth more money. Having said all those things though, the port's losing money. If we are going to run the port only on the basis of profit and loss, this is its cash flow after debt service. Only when you stick in the Commonwealth subsidy does the port make money. That's why in the newspaper you'll read that One side will say they're making money, another side will say they're losing money. Well, that's because one side is looking at this number and the other side is looking at that number. But if this were a private business, we'd say they're losing money. However, it's not clear that that's the only thing we should be concerned about in the port. Maybe we're not running it on or should run it on a profit and loss basis, but instead we should be thinking about how do we create the most jobs or the greatest value of economic activity in Virginia as opposed to profit and loss. But if you're the state government, you're the Secretary of Transportation and the governor, you're looking at this and saying, hey, we're losing money. There's somebody out there who says they'll give us $4 billion over the next 60 years. We won't have to pay the lease cost that we're paying APM Maersk now in Portsmouth. We're paying them $40 million a year. And they're sort of saying, this is a lot of money, and if you want to build bridges and tunnels and stuff like that, that looks pretty good. So these are the kinds of things that are being balanced. Politically, though, I think the story is already written. I don't think, I'd be surprised anyway, that privatization would occur now. But I think the VPA, VIT structure is going to get reorganized. There's a degree of inefficiency and overlap there, and there's some costs that I think almost surely could be eliminated. And of course, they've had a turnover in major personnel. This is a complicated issue, and especially in the newspaper, there was an opinion piece by an APM person the other day in the newspaper who focused on this rather than other kinds of things. And what he said was true, it just isn't the entire picture. But similarly, the Maritime Association tends to look at this and tends to not focus on this. We're losing market share. We've got to do better. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about the tourist industry and hotels. RevPAR is revenue per available room. This is the coin of the realm in terms of evaluating how well a hotel or motel or industry is doing. You can see we've gone down more than most other people have gone down. And Chesapeake, Suffolk, and Williamsburg in particular have gone down. It's not really a Virginia Beach problem, you can say. It's a Chesapeake, Suffolk, and Williamsburg problem. Well, let's drill into that a little bit more to find out why. Well, first of all, look at market shares. This was Williamsburg in 1999 as a share of total regional tourism. And you can see where we are for Williamsburg in 2011. If you've heard me speak before, you know that at this point I go back to my youth and I say, you remember the old rock and roll song, don't know much about history. Well, lots of young people don't. They can go back to the ocean front over and over again, but going back to Williamsburg and the historic triangle repetitively is not something that apparently they like to do. Williamsburg, the historic triangle, then has kind of a problem in terms of how do they pose themselves. A month or so ago, I was down in Fredericksburg, Texas, the home of Chester Nimitz, and the Museum of the Pacific is there. And it's really neat, but it also has a lot of electronics. And these kids are down there and they're doing all this stuff, and then they're invading Guadalcanal and they're refighting Midway, and they're captivated by that stuff. Now, maybe life shouldn't be that way, but we don't have those kinds of things in the historic triangle. Maybe we should never have it, but all I got to say is that's one of the reasons this market share, in my view, has declined, because the current attractions there don't appeal to the young people that they have to attract and want to come.
That includes Busch Gardens though too, right?
And includes Busch Gardens.
Is it been going down or is it?
Busch Gardens is doing sort of okay, not as badly as the rest. Williamsburg, though, this is the number of available rooms. Williamsburg isn't in trouble because they built too many rooms. It's just that people aren't showing up. Contrast that to Chesapeake, Suffolk. Chesapeake, Suffolk built lots of new capacity over the last couple of years. More people are staying in rooms there, but not at quite the same rate. Chesapeake, Suffolk, of course, isn't so much of a tourist place. This is business activity. They will grow out of this. This is largely a matter of building too much capacity, somewhat in anticipation of what was going to happen at JustCon and modeling and simulation and so forth. And they will grow out of this. Williamsburg, not necessarily the case. Some quick remarks about housing. We really have turned the corner in the region. If you're looking at sales prices, inventory, the proportion of distressed sales has gone down. But now, this is Jim Koch, the bad news guy. Housing is dramatically influenced by the state of the economy. If you don't have a job or you're being furloughed, you can't buy a house. And the direction of causation in our economy runs more from the economy to housing rather than the other way around. And so if our economic condition in the region deteriorates or stagnates, don't expect the housing market to do exceptionally well in the region. There's some pent-up demand and so forth there, but there's also some sort of invisible supply where people haven't put their homes on sale because they didn't think they could sell them. But this is what you need to keep your eye on now. So quick remarks about the arena. This says it. I was asked to do an economic impact study of the proposed arena. I did it. Apparently, somebody in the city, NHKS, didn't think my numbers were large enough, so they commissioned 2 other studies, one of which came up with numbers 5 times as large as mine. I thought my numbers were large, actually, because there are sort of 2 issues here. One was, how many people could we reliably predict would drive from, let's say, Richmond or someplace like that to go to an evening NBA game in Virginia Beach? I was pessimistic about those numbers, but I went with the city's assumptions there and came up with numbers that I already thought were a little bit high. But the other major issue here is the thing called displacement. You can't spend the same dollar 2 places. So if someone goes to an NBA game in the arena, rather than spending money at the Lynn Haven Mall or on the ocean front, the city of Virginia Beach is no better off. That's not economic development, that's a net zero. I'm reminded that in Norfolk, the city council there gave a Chick-fil-A operator $250,000 of incentives to develop a restaurant. Now, think about that. Where do we think these customers are coming from? From Richmond to Chick-fil-A? No, they're coming from other restaurants in the city. So this is displaced expenditures. It's out of one pocket in another. It's not net economic development. Well, I haven't really read through the study that Chris Tamura did in Richmond that came up with numbers 5 times as large as mine, but I would guess that they were not including displaced expenditure. But that's not real economic development, folks. That's just simply taking money from one entrepreneur and giving it to another. Q&A. Yes?
Back when you were talking about what has really improved things for Savannah's port was the number of warehouses being built. Who's building the warehouses? Walmart building them all, so that they have it, or is Savannah Port or someone building them leasing?
Typically, it's the business like Walmart or Costco that's building it, but then also there have to be economic incentives to get them there, some tax rebates, and you have to have good highway transportation, maybe rail transportation, so all of those other things feed into it. So it's essentially a public-private partnership there.
So we haven't been doing a good job
Well,
of that.
That hasn't been our emphasis. We're now doing a bit more of that, and especially in western Suffolk, seeing some of those things open. But they have about twice as many of those large operations as we do, and that's worked out better for them. Yes.
With regards to ports, I would think that our area should be pretty strong with as far as for coal transportation. A lot of times, you look at a Lynn Haven inlet, and there are coal colliers that are waiting out there for days and weeks and everything. Is it because the facilities for offloading coal that we have here is not large enough? Is it not robust enough? And is that something that we need to capitalize on?
We have enough coal facilities to handle what's out there. If there's any problem now, it is that concern over the environment and so forth has begun to cause coal shipments from Western Virginia, West Virginia, et cetera, to begin to decline. That's a concern for Norfolk Southern. Hasn't hurt them too much thus far because they're doing lots of other things. But we appear to have enough capacity right now to handle the coal that would come through here. Yes.
I was looking at your numbers, and it looked like the Charlotte area was pretty successful. How much of that can you attribute to large banks being in your hub? And they're the only ones that seem to be profiting right now.
Well, a lot of that is due to banking, but they have more Fortune's 500 headquarters in general than we do. They have some things that we don't do, and they're more of a coherent area. You know, we're 7 cities, and we speak sometimes with 7 voices. They tend to have a more rational, coherent economic strategy that says this is what we want to do, and they go ahead and do it.
But it is one city, right? It's not multiple
But
cities.
It's one dominant city, and we don't have that here. Banking has been important for them. It's also been a drag for them, like in 2008, 2009. But the feds were very nice, the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, in terms of bailing out banks and so forth, and that was really pretty critical for them. But they have lots of other things going on there that we don't hear.
If we email you, could you send? If we email you, could you send us a copy of your
Absolutely.
notes?
Yeah.
Yes.
In fact, anybody who,
Where can we?
you can. This is downloaded on this computer right now, so anybody can get at that right now before I leave. But I'm jkoch at odu.edu, jkoch@odu.edu. So email me and I'll certainly send you the slides. Yes.
Thank you.
Do you see the culture of this area changing in terms of how they view themselves and how we view ourselves in terms of, like you said, the different cities, and then looking at how they're going to economically sustain each city with what each city has looked at for what's its identity?
Well, are we going to change? Well, the answer is yes. Herb Stein, the economist, who's now dead, once said, things that can't go on forever don't. And it's Ben Stein is his son, you've probably seen him in the movies and so forth. But anyway, we aren't doing well economically, and that will cause us to change our behavior over time. I certainly see differences between now and 1990 when I first came to the region. We do some things now that we didn't used to, and some things we're a little bit more regional on than we used to be. I see progress there, but it's really pretty slow. And if you're talking about how this is going to actually occur, frankly, I think we have to almost have a car wreck before people change their
What's
behavior.
the short answer, sir?
My short answer is no in the short run. I don't It's going to take a long time and a lot of economic grief before people will sort of come and say, look, how can we change this? How can we make ourselves better off?
One thing we did not touch upon, one thing we didn't touch upon is light rail. Since our economy is dropping, the population's not growing, nothing's happening, you can't justify light rail. Is that correct? Would you agree with that at this time, to be honest?
Well, if the measure is whether or not light rail will pay for itself or won't, if there are other kinds of measures one wants to look at in terms of congestion and pollution and so forth, and sort of looking forward to the future, it may or may not be a good idea. The light rail low now in Norfolk is a system that sort of doesn't go anywhere. Light rail has to go to large population centers in order to succeed. Our large population centers are in Virginia Beach. They would be like an Old Dominion at the Navy base, maybe going to Portsmouth, maybe to Lynn Haven or someplace like that.
What's the large population center in Virginia Beach?
That's good. essentially along the I-264 corridor.
That's not a population center.
No, it isn't.
We have none.
We have none.
That's right.
The light rail systems, though, that are regarded as successful still require a subsidy, typically ranging about 80% of the fare of somebody who gets on a light rail car. We're right now a little bit above that in Norfolk. I think we're like 85 or 90% of somebody's fare who gets on is being subsidized by taxpayers and at large. It's hard to tell exactly there because they don't keep good track of who is boarding, and some of the accounting is a little bit mysterious as to how they allocate costs.
Yeah.
Me?
Yes, go ahead.
I've got another question. Seeing as what's happened since 2007, it seems like the non-military areas that didn't have that buffer took their haircut. And I'm not saying that it may be probably our turn to now follow suit. It's like we're all going to have to sacrifice, and I'm not saying that, you know, to be malicious or anything, but I'm thinking that the ones that took the haircut early on, it's now come to our point where we're going to have to take some kind of sacrifice, and that includes DC and the military areas here.
Well, that's certainly the view of most people in the country, or I
Yes.
wouldn't say most people, but lots of people in
Yes.
the country at large. We're an impacted community here, much more sensitive to all this than other people, but you know, the reaction to sequestration nationally has been remarkably mild.
It's not going to affect them as much as it is.
Doesn't affect most people a whole lot yet.
When they first started talking about the arena, and they made this assumption that a whole new region was going to be created, you alluded to it, that included Richmond. You created this thing called Southeastern Virginia that included Marengo County and Richmond and everything. And it was in my view, the dumbest assumption in the world. I grew up in Richmond, in the west end of Richmond. I never thought anybody from the west end of Richmond would come down here for an NBA game. If they like NBA, they might have been going to Washington now, right? But as you said, there were 2 studies done based on the city's assumption, that assumption. Is it the role of the economist and the people doing the study to tell the people who are hiring them, your assumption is probably stupid before you go actually do the study?
Not if you ever want to get hired.
You know, they hired me because I have a kind of reputation as a truth teller. And I did the study, and they didn't like the numbers, and so they did other studies. That's all I have to say.
I wanted to hear pretty loud.
I have a question too about looking at diversification of the economy. Any thought, or do you have any ideas about what industries would be good for here, and what in particular might be energy exploration?
Yeah, energy over the long term could certainly be a plus for this region. And that's really going to take a long time. And you know, I don't want to say we're not going to see drilling in my lifetime. I hope I live longer than that. But it's going to take a long time, so I don't think we're going to see that very quickly. If you look at Hampton Roads relative to, let's say, Richmond, Baltimore, places like that, the major difference between us and them is we don't have the large higher education research medical complex they have. Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore generates $1.4 billion of funded research every year. You take all the universities in Hampton Roads together, and we sum to like 175, of which Old Dominion's about 100. We just don't have that going on here, and those are high-paying jobs, they're clean jobs, they're the kinds that we need to have. We just haven't done that. We also, though, I think ought to pay a little bit more attention to gardening things already that are here. As I drive to Old Dominion every morning, I go down 25th Street simply because there aren't many stop signs there, and I can go faster. I confess. I go by the O'Connor Brewery. New business, expanding. Now, we don't want to subsidize O'Connor, but we need to talk to the O'Connors of the world and say, how can we make life easier on you? I mean, is it a matter of permitting? Do you need consulting? Do you need this? I'd like to see us do more of that. And then here in Virginia Beach, there's a huge firm, Amerigroup. Now, I know they sold out, but they're Fortune 500 in size. They have the kind of business where we can employ people here and they can serve them all over the nation. We find out how we can make life easier for them so that they can expand and do more things here. And how do we get more Amerigroups here? Because that's a pretty neat kind of industry to have. Yes.
Me again, I'm sorry. You did mention schools and universities. I would like you to give us some information about the next bubble that may burst, and that may be all this guaranteed loans by the federal government to people that are going to school, and that is going to the schools, and how that will affect the universities.
Wasn't really appropriate for this presentation, but I have some slides that show a huge increase in student debt. And this is at a time when students are having trouble finding jobs when they get out of school. That's problematic because if you sell houses or sell nearly anything, you can't sell houses to students who come out with $150,000 worth of debt and no job. It's just not going to happen. So that's a problem for us. But you talk about bubbles in general. I think Ben Bernanke actually did a pretty good job 2008, 2009, 2010 in keeping the economy from imploding. But now we're in this regime where interest rates are very low, and that makes it much easier for people to borrow money. It's probably inflated commodity prices, perhaps real estate prices. There are a variety of assets now whose prices are higher than they would be if interest rates were at more normal levels. The real test for Bernanke now is how does he get out of this? Now that we've done all this quantitative easing and the Fed quadrupled the size of its portfolio in terms of the assets, it bought all these bonds and bad mortgages and so forth, how do we sort of back out of that and get ourselves into a more normal context where, you know, right now, what does a one-year CD pay? 1/10%? You know, I go back to Herb Stein, this is something that can go on forever. So we need to figure out a good way to take care of that. And the student loan thing, though, I've got some slides that show households have really deleveraged, less credit card debt, less mortgage debt. People are getting their balance sheets in order, but not students. That's the single exception. Student debt has gone up terrifically.
When we look at this area, we form, not you, but the business people form things like the Hampton Roads Partnership. They start out with this regional, we're going to work together. What happens when they de facto desegregate in terms of our economy and looking at Virginia Beach as we were basically tourism? So when now we're just out there because the other, the other cities, they're not in like the little cul-de-sac, so they're still on, on the main transportation lines where we are not. So how does that affect us and these organizations that come together as a regional one, beginning with the Hampton Roads Partnership?
Well, we have quite a few of those organizations. That's part of the problem.
That's my point.
We don't have a single voice for the region. When I was in Richmond for 11 years representing Old Dominion University, there were all kinds of discordant voices there. But if you talk about Northern Virginia, they came with a single voice, so did Richmond. And we just don't have that going on yet. So we have lots of different voices, and as a consequence, we have a greater degree of difficulty getting things accomplished now, and sort of telling our story, because we have people pulling in different directions.
But where does that leave Virginia Beach?
Well, leaves Virginia Beach the same place as Norfolk and Newport News and so forth, where we sort of, each city plays its own game, which is understandable.
I hear so much about regionalism. I'm still not clear as to how Virginia Beach specifically benefits from what goes on in Chesapeake and Hampton.
That's my point.
In regionalism, and I don't mean to denigrate any other city, but why do I care what's going on in Chesapeake? How's that going to affect or benefit me?
Well, I've got another slide that has a matrix showing how a job, let's say in Virginia Beach, affects people in Chesapeake and Newport News and so forth, and we really are a highly interdependent area. That's one of the dangers, incidentally, with tolling lots of things. It's going to cut off some of that interdependence. But when a job appears in Suffolk, something like 7 or 8% of all the people who are working in Suffolk come from Virginia Beach. The income comes here, and vice versa. And something like 12, 13% of the jobs people go across the water. So we're really highly dependent, and so it is simply not the case that when the economic development people announce a job, let's say in Newport News, that Virginia Beach doesn't benefit and vice versa. We really do.
Most of the Ford plant jobs were in Virginia Beach.
Yeah. The Ford Motor Assembly Plant, there were more jobs in Virginia Beach and Chesapeake than there were in Rutherford. So we have to take that sort of attitude because it's really true that we're dependent on each other. And we have to therefore think about those kinds of things and not quite be as narrowly focused.
When you talked about,
You cut me off.
final question, quick. You talked about like John Hopkins and stuff, and there was an article a couple months ago about William and Mary and EVMS maybe combining together. Is that still a possibility, or is that dead in the water now? Or?
Well, I don't know what the possibilities are, but it's not a very good idea. I was on the medical school board for 10 or 12 years, president of Old Dominion for 11. But, William and Mary is a prestigious institution. EVMS would be buying a very good name, but it has a very small science complex, and the people, the faculty members are 50 miles away. I mean, do we really think they're going to drive through the tunnel to teach courses at EVMS? This isn't how we're going to achieve fame and prosperity. Eventually, to be very frank, it has to be Old Dominion. But Old Dominion's a pauper, and so is EVMS. Neither one has any money. So, it's like getting married to somebody who is bankrupt. Not a very good
Love
idea.
conquers all.
William and Mary has money and prestige, but I'd be very surprised if I were the president there that I wouldn't want to start sending it all to EVMS. I'm not sure what it is that William and Mary would get from it.